Fundamentalism and evangelical Christianity have become undeniably linked to the far right movement in the United States. But believe it or not, this radical shift has largely taken place over just the past century. Welcome back to Reimagining Ourselves, where we discuss mental health and wellness, society, and culture. With biblical instructions such as, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Matthews 19:21. Or Christians should lend a helping hand to those who have stumbled. Acts 20:35. Many Christians are compelled to follow in Jesus' footsteps and live a life of altruism and kindness. However, of course, we know that that has not always been the case. And like the violent crusades, the modern day radicalization of Christians to the alt-right is a huge distortion and manipulation of Christian values. There has been a concerted effort over the past century from the Republican Party to secure the evangelical Christian vote, and I'd say that they have largely been successful. The development of what is now termed the religious right has been especially prominent since the 1970s. I'm going to go into some details of this, but let me just give you a quick overview. During this time, talk shows and television ministries were rising in popularity. These programs, which used the same attention economy that our media uses today, but with this thin veneer of being spiritual sustenance. Just like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell were involved in political lobbying groups like the Moral Majority or the Christian Coalition, and they really blurred the lines between spirituality and conservative values. These were predecessors to the James Dobson focus on the family mess that I definitely want to dive more deeply into in another episode. So subscribe and hit that notification bell if you haven't already. James Dobson is the author of Dare to Discipline and The Strong-Willed Child, which promote the kind of corporal punishment that quickly devolves into physical abuse, as we discussed in episode 16. And this man is a prime example of someone whose goals are political, not spiritual, and certainly not of God. As Tia Levings puts it, they play a long game. Most of what we see in our headlines today, especially with Project 2025, has strategic origins that go back 40 to 50 years. They're okay raising generations, outlasting presidencies, and waiting for judicial seats to open, but they never take their eye off the prize, end quote. These groups spend large sums of money lobbying to Congress to further the goals of the religious right. A perfect example of their influence is the unprecedented revocation of Roe v. Wade. Never before has the Supreme Court ruled to strip the American citizens of a right. Never have they voted to support state rights to deny citizens certain protections. And let's quickly discuss the history of attitudes about abortion, because while I wouldn't go so far as to say that Christians never cared about it before, it was not such a salient, emotional, and hot button issue the way it is now. It was never at the very top of everybody's list on what mattered. That was something that was intentionally cultivated and stoked for reasons well outside of God and God's will. Until the mid 19th century, the general attitude towards abortion in the United States was the same as it was most other places internationally and historically. That is, it was a generally accepted fact of life and seen as morally neutral up until the quickening. So, what changed? Well, the first thing actually had nothing to do with religion. The American Medical Association of 1857, which excluded women and black people from membership, targeted midwives in response to the financial and social power that they were cultivating. These midwives were supporting women with family planning in a variety of ways and passing down ancient herbal remedies that would trigger miscarriage. The main reason that this was first concerning to the American Medical Association was because they took their role of gatekeeping who could practice medicine very seriously. This issue has always been linked to white supremacy and patriarchy, which, as I've said before, I think are the devil's work. This theme of using anti-abortion rhetoric to control women continues to persist almost 2 centuries later. But that's also a future conversation. For the sake of this episode, I just want to explore some of the strategies that were used by extremist groups looking for political power to create a voting bloc of Christian conservatives. These manipulation tactics are well documented and chilling. These institutes spend enormous sums of money targeting key states with grassroots mobilizations of voters to win elections for Republican politicians who have promised them political power. They carefully track what rhetoric on what topic generates the most money and gets the voters out to that poll, and then they tailor their message to fit that rhetoric. It seems painfully clear that the motive here is total power, total control, total domination. It's just an extension of the kind of twisted doctrine that, in my opinion, feeds into a spiritual illness of needing to have power and control over other people. I'm about to run through a timeline of political religious entanglement, specifically between the Republican Party and evangelical Christians, so that we can see how this really started to shift in the 70s. And I'm going to start us off with a man named Billy Graham. Billy Graham, who was often referred to as America's favorite pastor, served as a direct liaison to the conservative Christian Party for multiple right-wing politicians. Billy Graham was one of the first televangelists, and he gained unprecedented levels of political power. He became widely known as the pastor to the White House. During the Eisenhower administration and the Cold War, Graham was instrumental in linking evangelicalism to patriotism. Because evangelicals were strongly anti-communist, this presented a unique opportunity for evangelicals to ally themselves with conservative politicians. And this would begin a lengthy and disturbing entanglement that has skewed Christianity. I want to acknowledge that many loved Graham and have memorialized him as a man of God who shared messages of forgiveness and unconditional love. And while this was sometimes true, Graham was also a self-proclaimed crusader who used hot-button issues of the time like abortion and homosexuality to prey on people's rage and create political action. He used his platform to secure political wins, and the loyalty he cultivated with Christians translated directly into political action. Graham encouraged Southern Baptists to denounce their traditional association to the Democratic Party and pledged their allegiance to the GOP. Billy Graham and Richard Nixon met in Washington, D.C. in the early 1950s and initiated a close relationship that would span decades. In 1956, Graham arranged for Richard Nixon to speak at the Southern Baptist Convention's Home Mission Board, and in 1960, Billy Graham gave an invocation at a political rally for Nixon. In 1969, Graham came to share Lyndon B. Johnson's last night in the White House. Then he held the first White House church service for Nixon. In 1970, Nixon became the first president to speak from a preacher's pulpit. Then in 72, Nixon was invited to address the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting. That same year, 1972, Graham and Nixon had a troubling conversation that was caught on tape. And bear with me for just a second about this. In 92, the National Archives released a recording of Graham and Nixon discussing their concerns around Jewish influences on the media. Graham commented that he had friends in the press who were Jewish and that they swarm around me and are friendly with me, but says that they don't know how he really feels about what they're doing to this country. Graham was part of a campaign called Key 73, a major crusading effort aimed at converting all North American citizens to Christianity. When the details of this campaign were revealed, Jewish leaders spoke out about their concerns on how this might reignite anti-Semitic sentiments. So this conversation where Graham is bonding with a politician about their shared goal of destabilizing Jewish influence is fairly concerning. As I've said before, I don't believe that any exclusion is, of God, so Graham had a deep entanglement with politics and a clear desire for secular power. Graham, like others before and after him, had a radical focus on abortion that served mainly to manipulate voters. Political and religious leaders found this to be a provocative way to coerce Christians into voting in a particular way that would provide them the most control and power. When you hear any religious leader that focuses on anti-abortion instead of the circumstances that would push a woman into making that decision, like inadequate birth control options or sexual assault, that is a huge red flag. An abortion is a physically and often emotionally painful experience. Nobody is getting them for fun, so it really should be at the bottom of everyone's priorities. So anyway, thank you for bearing with me. Back to this timeline. After his years of political involvement, Graham later famously said, "The hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it." This quote came in 1981. It would seem long after America's favorite pastor became disillusioned with his involvement with Republican campaigns. He also told Christianity Today in 2011 that if he could do anything differently, he would have steered clear of politics. You have to wonder what was weighing on his conscience. In the early 1980s, the Christian right strategists helped elect Ronald Reagan by using abortion and gay rights as pain points. In return, Reagan strategically strengthened the Christian right's ties to Republican leaders. Down the line, Republican strategist Karl Rove recognized the religious right as a key voting bloc, though he was quoted and documented as saying, "I am not fortunate enough to be a man of faith." Karl Rove spoke at numerous religious events and played to the well-developed propaganda to push the narrative that conservatives have Christian values in mind. As political columnist John Chait comments, "If you don't believe in God, then why would you think believers are fortunate for putting their faith in a non-existent higher being? You wouldn't." Yet Rove, for political reasons, must genuflect to the notion that religious people are morally superior to atheists. The line perfectly encapsulates the condescending way Republican elites have manipulated religion. James Dobson, who, like I said, we'll discuss much more deeply in a future episode, was credited as instrumental to George W. Bush's election in 2004. Richard A. Viguerie, a Republican Party fundraiser, is quoted as saying, "I can't think of anybody who has had more impact on the 2004 election outcomes than Dr. Dobson. He was the 800-pound gorilla." In the spring of 2005, the top Republican leaders of the Congress met with Dobson, Perkins, and a few other religious right activists in a private session. It is reported that the Republican leaders promised to push the religious rights agenda. Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, seemed to have learned plenty of these political strategies from his father. Franklin Graham, another televangelist, is even more blatantly crooked and radical than his father was. Franklin Graham started angling for Donald Trump's bid for presidency as early as 2011. He came under a bit of fire in 2015 after it was discovered that his salary was over $850,000 a year, and that is just the reported salaries from his two charitable organizations. His net worth is at least $10 million, and there are allegations that it has mysteriously risen to $48 million in the last 5 years. In 2019, Donald Trump spoke at the Values Voters Summit. In keeping with this tradition of appealing to the religious right, he starts his speech with references to God Almighty and a suspiciously uncharacteristic reverence for the divine. At first, he's unrecognizable to the Donald Trump who has been flouting his immoral lifestyle for decades. But shortly thereafter, his speech, like so many before, devolved into an unhinged tirade. You can find it in my references. It's honestly appalling. But for reasons unknown, Franklin Graham has touted a number of misleading claims about Trump, saying that he defends the Christian faith and publicly praying for him to win the election. Trump, who is the first president to be convicted of criminal charges, found guilty of 34 felonies, who has publicly boasted that it does not matter how terrible his behavior is because the American people will keep supporting him. During a speech at a private evangelical college, Trump says, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?" It's like incredible. And he's right. How is that possible? Largely because these people looking for political power are basically gaslighting Christian communities into believing that Trump stands for Christian values. When we piece together the schemes of these high-profile religious leaders, the Franklin Grahams and James Dobsons, it seems clear that they are motivated by political power, not spreading love and peace. So when you have these type of people conspiring with politicians about just what to say and what buttons to push to get the Christian voting bloc, you end up with the religious right. The cult-like tactics of demanding unquestioning obedience and radical separatism that we discussed last episode leaves these communities largely under the control of their church leadership. This church leadership is attending these conferences and being explicitly told that they should encourage their congregation to vote for the Republican candidate. And in these conferences are conflict entrepreneurs before the internet who are getting people riled up about these few issues to manipulate them into voting a certain way. You've just heard the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the ways that this leadership is under the puppet strings of these politicians and vice versa. But make no mistake that it's about power and control, and I have no doubt that these men can feel that what they're doing is wrong. I think that they know it's sinful, they know it's evil, and they do it anyway. The same things that have allowed widespread physical and sexual abuse in evangelical communities, for example, an emphasis on hierarchy and the subjugation of women and children, lend themselves easily to white supremacy and hyper-individualism, which more and more become alarming tenets of right-wing conservatism. These strategies make me angry. They are so nasty, they have nothing to do with God, and they are so damaging for many people's spirituality. To associate the name of God with white supremacy, suppression, violence, and hatred, I can just feel that deep inside me, in that place that is connected to the divine, that God finds this abhorrent. I'm going to leave it there for today. I hope I did this episode justice and helped paint a picture of exactly how insidious this radicalization is. It's shocking the way that conservative evangelicals have become a voting bloc for the far right. Honestly, I know I was a little all over the place. I was so overwhelmed with everything I was finding about this corruption while I was researching for this episode, and I had to resist going down several more avenues because a comprehensive cover of this topic could span multiple volumes of books. I was deep in the archives of government websites where this information is difficult to access but public, and I felt like I could just keep going forever. So I don't think I will ever run out of material for these podcast episodes. Thank you so much for listening today. If you've made it this far, I am so grateful and I really appreciate your support. I'll meet you here next time on Reimagining Ourselves.